All right, so now let's return to kind of the idea conceptually of what pre-money valuation is. So this really is the value of the business plan. It's the value of being able to turn an investment in a widget factory into cash flows and eventually an exit where we sell this company in the future. So this includes all the inflows and the outflows that are required to run the company. And like I said before, they can be negative, right? We need to put cash out in order to buy the things we need to make the company work going forward. Right? So when we think about this method and we apply the appropriate discount rate to these valuation cash flows, we get the proper value of that business plan. And importantly, this is all owned by the entrepreneur or the current owners of the company. Right? They've created this business plan and this way to basically transform investment into future cash flows. So that's value that the entrepreneur has. As we flip over to post-money valuation, this is once we've added that additional capital in. And now this is no longer just the entrepreneurs, right? The entrepreneur has the business plan, which is worth what it's worth. And the investor now includes their contributed capital, right? So the post-money valuation includes both the investment cash and also the value of that business plan. So here you can see I've restated the value of the business plan simply as kind of the NPV pre-money and the NPV post-money, right? The business plan has really not changed at all here, right? We started with the same business plan. It's just when we get money to come in, we now have that extra, in this case, $1 million in the company. So what I really want to stress here and kind of the important concept to get is that when the entrepreneur raises money, they're not giving up value at all, right? To begin with, they had $316,000 of a business plan and they owned 100% of it, right? They owned the 100% of the business plan and $316,000 of value. When they go out and raise equity, they certainly sell equity in the company, and that company is that new combined entity of that capital plus the business plan, right? They don't give up any value in that process, right? However, they do now own less equity in that combined company, and that's because they now own part of a bigger company, right? They still own 24% of that bigger company, and their value is still that $316,000. It's just now they partially own that investment plus the business plan, and their investor now owns, a majority of the business plan and the capital, but bringing them together means that they didn't necessarily exchange value. They just combined resources to create a bigger pie that now they both share. Now, importantly, in everything that I've said so far, we haven't really talked about how this money is coming in, whether it's debt or equity, and we're really just focusing on the cash flows. And that's an important thing to note about discounted cash flow methods. Typically, we're just looking at the cash flows that are coming in. And so really we can think about this as asset side valuation. Right? We're thinking about the asset side of the balance sheet and we're valuing the cash on it. Right? Now, with one thing that accounting gives us is that assets are equal to liabilities and owner's equity. That's true on a balance sheet, and it's also true conceptually with valuation. Right? If the assets are on the left-hand side and owner's equity and liabilities are on the right-hand side, whatever the value of all those cash flows is, has to be equal to the value of those liabilities and owner's equity, right? This is where we could think about splitting the value of the stock in the company versus the debt in the company. So if we want to value the equity in the company, and we're an all-equity company, that equity must be equal to the value of, once we subtract liabilities, must be equal to the value of those cash flows, all right? So this is all predicated on this idea that we can get an appropriate discount rate, so we don't have to necessarily model explicitly where the money's coming from. And so in this process, we're assuming that we can get capital at an appropriate discount rate, right? Is that always the case? Well, not necessarily in reality, but this is where we get the idea of efficient markets. So if markets are efficient, then we can get kind of that capital at the required discount rate, which is based on the riskiness of our cash flows. Now in reality, right, markets aren't always efficient. Why not? Well, for one, say you're a startup that's a software startup in Tucson versus a software startup in San Francisco, right? San Francisco has a much hotter tech startup scene than Tucson, Arizona. And as a result, we expect capital to be easier to come by. You're easier to find venture capitalists and meet up with them. Tucson doesn't have quite the same scene, and so it's going to be a little harder to find your investors. Harder to find investors means also you're going to have a higher cost of capital associated with that. But there are other factors that can also affect the cost of capital, right? If we think about, venture capitalists and what that discount rate is actually going to do, well, there are activities that venture capitalists perform that are not necessarily strictly related to the riskiness of the cash flows, right? Venture capitalists do due diligence. They're going to come out and examine companies. They're going to, listen to pitch meetings for lots of different companies, many of which they're not going to invest in. And at the end of the day, if they're going to contribute their capital to a company, they expect to be compensated for all their costs. So while strictly speaking, we'd like the discount rate to just reflect the riskiness of the cash flows, that's not always the case. Instead, we're going to, add in basically premiums onto that discount rate to account for things like due diligence, listening to pitch meetings, advice going forward from venture capitalists. And so their other costs are basically compensated and are paid for by the entrepreneur through a higher discount rate. On a personal finance level, you could actually think about this from a mortgage perspective. Many times, origination fees or loan processing costs or any number of costs associated with getting a loan to buy a house get rolled into the mortgage interest rate. And so that's one way that we see interest rates don't always just reflect risk of cash flows, but can also reflect other costs as well. So one thing that you're going to feel when you're building financial statements and doing a pre-money valuation where there's lots of negative values on the balance sheet, you're going to sit there and say, this doesn't look right. We need the investment, right? We need the investment. That way we don't have all these negative cash flows. And let me remind you, if we return to our model, right, in this pre-money valuation, we see lots of negative values of surplus cash in our balance sheet. Right? Again, this could freak out investors a little bit. Those investors say, hey, what are all this negative cash? The company's going to be bankrupt. Right? Again, you're not going to show a pre-money valuation to investors. It's used strictly for evaluation purposes. The post-money valuation, on the other hand, has positive balances, right? Because we've already had the investment come in. This is kind of the idealized, once you join us as an investor, now this is what our balance sheet looks like. Again, we get the same valuation out, the same post-money versus pre-money valuation. They tie together the same way. It's just this is a much more intuitively appealing presentation. So again, you're going to think about this, we need the investment. So why is it okay for us to model it with this pre-money valuation way? Even though we're showing negative values, we're still accounting for that capital and the cost of that capital. We're just doing it through the discount rate, right? That is ultimately where we account for the cost of capital in any valuation model. Whether we've explicitly put the valuation or the investment in there or not, we're accounting for that cost of that value, that investment through the discount rate. And really what's important to remember here is that the entrepreneur is not giving up any of his value when we do this, right? While the investment is making it so the balance sheet all looks, positive and reasonable, he's not giving up any value in the process. His value stays the same. He owns a smaller part of what's now a bigger combined business, right? So you're not giving up any of your total value. You're just getting a smaller piece of a bigger combined pie. All right, let's link back to our example. So back to our example, just kind of refresh our parameters. We had this $1 million investment. We had $10,000 of exit value, 50% high discount rate, 2 million shares currently, pre-money value of $316,000, post-money of $1,316,000. And using those together, we found that investor should get about 76% of the company. So now let's just see, how would we actually split that up with our 2 million shares of stock? So we have 2 million shares of stock existing. So one way that's not on this slide is we could just give 74% of those shares, 76% to the new investor. And we keep 2 million shares outstanding. We just, sell those new shares to the investor. Alternatively, you can issue new shares. So this example just shows you what it would take to issue new shares. We take the new shares divided by the new plus the original. That has to be equal to 76%. We can then solve for the fact that in this example, we need to issue a few more than 6 million shares of stock in the new company. With that, then, we can get to ultimately what a lot of valuation models want to get to is a share price, right? We know the value of the company, the post-money valuation, and then we can take that post-money valuation, divide by the number of shares outstanding, or alternatively, in this example, we can take the new investment, right? So just the investment piece, divide by that investor's shares to get how much they're basically paying per share of stock in the company. Now, finally, to wrap up, right? The venture capital method, we want to remember, it pushes cash flows kind of forward into the future until that exit value. So it's going to be a little bit more conservative than our pseudo dividend method. We're also doing asset side valuation here, right? We're assuming everything based on cash flows, and then we're assuming that we're getting the right discount rate. So we have to do a lot to think about, are we getting the right discount rate when we discount cash flows like this? But importantly, that allows us to not necessarily think about where the actual financing is going to come from. We don't have to have that investor lined up. We just have to figure out what is our fair discount rate given the riskiness of these cash flows and perhaps market imperfections that prevent us from necessarily accessing that capital market as efficiently as possible. Once we've incorporated that into the discount rate, we don't have to necessarily worry where the financing is coming from, and we can still value our business without knowing that we've already lined up investors. Importantly, once we get that valuation done, the entrepreneur never gives up value in the company, right? He will sell equity, but the total value of his ownership after he sells that equity is the same as it was before, right? He just owns a smaller piece of that bigger pie. And if there are changes that happen to the entrepreneur's value during the process of raising money, those are often due to changes in the business plan, right? If I go to to an investor, and the investor says, "Oh, you think you're going to, need $1,000 to run this business. I think you actually need $2,000 to run this business." That's a change in the business plan, that you need a $2,000 factory to produce all those widgets in the future, not a $1,000 factory. And if that changes, now the business plan is changing. So if the business plan changes, the valuation can change for the entrepreneur, but now we're arguing over business plan assumptions and not necessarily how we split the company once we combine together that business plan plus that outside investment. And so DCF analysis gives us a way to estimate that business plan value. That way, when we go out and raise money, we can now figure out how much of the company is split between the entrepreneur and the investors.